Today I'm going to show you how to replace the water pump in a 2014 Ford Focus. As you can see, it's got an O-ring, so there's no gasket. There's only 3 bolts that hold it in, but it's a little bit more difficult than that to get to, so let's go ahead and start on the car. The first thing you need to do is take this splash tray out from underneath the engine, and if your pump was leaking like mine was, you're going to want to rinse that off. All you need to do is use a T27 socket to take that off. Next we're going to go underneath the car and I'll show you how to drain the coolant. Okay, while we're underneath the car here, we need to drain the radiator, and there's 2 ways to do it. I'll show you the way that takes longer but is cleaner. Right here we've got a plastic pin. Well, there was. I'll show you in a minute. Then there's screws here and here. And then there's a few screws along this this valance or tray, whatever you want to call it. And then there's 2 screws and a plastic pin. And these plastic pins, there's also 2 of them up front. How they work is you put a screwdriver in here and then kind of work this loose, and they do end up breaking quite often, but it's a pretty common part. Like that. I actually pulled it all the way out, but then this will come out, and how they work is you I might have broken that one. Ah, there it goes. You pull that top loose, and then you can pull that pin out. So we'll do that with the other one right here, and then I've already got all the screws out and the other 2 of these plastic clips out, and then we can take this tray down. Okay, now that we've got that tray out of the way, you can see that there's this access hole so that we can drop coolant straight through into the catch pan instead of all over that tray. So you just insert a screwdriver in here and turn it counterclockwise, and then your coolant will run out right into a catch pan instead of all over that tray and then all over the ground. So we'll go ahead and let that run, and once that's empty we can start working on the water pump. You might want to crack the reservoir cap up top so it actually runs out, because if air can't get in, fluid can't come out. There, that's better. Flying out of there now. So all I did to make that start running again was I took the cap loose. Air in, fluid out. So once that drains down, we need to remove this coolant reservoir. So I'm going to let that empty first, and then I'll show you how to remove it. Most of the coolant's out of here, so we'll go ahead and throw the cap back on just so we don't spill anything. And what we need to do now is get this out of the way. So there's this hose here. You should be able to just pull it up and around. Take it out of this first clip. And then to release these, you just pull up with firm pressure, just this way, and then just back a little tiny bit, but mostly up, to release this one in the back. Then we've got it loose, and then we can just swing it out of the way and set it up on top of the intake. Now we've got access down here. Now to get to the water pump, which is this pulley down here with, oh shoot, the camera's not seeing it. There's this pulley right here with 3 bolts on it. That's the one we need to get to. So in order to do that, we need to remove this motor mount, and in order to do that, we need to support the engine from the bottom. It does not take a whole lot of pressure to support this engine. So what you're going to want to do is get a piece of wood, or I've got a rubber pad on mine. And you do not want to lift on this. This is just a thin guard for your air conditioner compressor. You want to lift on this part of the motor, this gray part, this pan. So try and be over towards this side, because that's the motor mount you're taking off. Put just enough pressure on it. You probably can't see it on camera, but I just gave it enough pressure that I saw the car rise just a tiny little bit. And that's just so I know that it's actually being supported. I'm not trying to lift the car by the bottom of the engine. It's just to support the engine. If you don't have a floor jack, you could probably cut a 2x4 just a little bit longer than how far it is from the ground to the bottom of the engine, and then just tap the bottom end over to hold this up. Next, we're going to be removing this engine mount assembly. So to do that, 18mm socket up here for these two, and then we've got a 15mm socket for that one and that one. So we'll go ahead and remove that. Your engine may shift while you're taking these out. If it does, no big deal. Just jack it back up a little bit. The other thing that might happen is the stud might come out instead of the nut coming off. We'll deal with that later. It's no big deal. But you do kind of need a special tool to put it back in because you need an internal torque socket. You cannot use a regular socket like this on that. Will not work. We'll deal with that later. So now that this engine mount is loose, we can just pull that off, take that out of the way. It only goes on one way, so you don't have to worry about orientation. And now we've got better access to our belt tensioner and our water pump. So now we need to take the belt off, and I think we can get away with leaving the tensioner on. We'll see. So to take this tensioner off, we need a 14mm socket and either a breaker bar or a ratchet. Okay, due to confined space, I'm just using 1/4" drive stuff. I've got a ratchet on here and a 14mm socket, and then you can just pull this over, and then you can slip this belt off, but I can't do that one-handed, so you know, it's pretty easy to figure out. Pull it over, take the belt off. While you're at it, it's also a good time to take a picture or save this spot in the video, the direction the belt goes. So it goes on the inside of the crankshaft pulley, comes up around the top of the tensioner, goes around the water pump, so it's the back side, the non-ribbed side goes around the water pump, and then it goes around the alternator and then back around the crank pulley. And then eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that I have a front cover leak, but that's a project for a different day because that means dropping the whole engine. So we're just going to fix the water pump today. You can see I've just got the belt laying off into the back there, and now we can take the pulley off of the water pump. Now this next step, it's up to you how you do it. You're going to have to use a 10mm wrench to take those 3 bolts out. I found that belt tension was not enough to break these bolts loose. Your car might be different. I would say try belt tension to hold that pulley first. This is a vice grip. I forget what model number, but it's a chain that goes around there and you can tighten it. Or you could possibly use like a big water pump pliers. Obviously, water pump pliers, slip joint pliers, whatever you want to call them. Or as an absolutely last resort, you could take a screwdriver and wedge it between the engine block and this pulley, but I'd almost guarantee that'll cause damage to either the engine, the pulley, or both. So this is what I'm doing. It might not work for you. Oh, one more thing you could do is use 2 wrenches and loosen it, and then spin it and loosen that one, and then, you know, with 1 wrench on one to loosen and 1 on the other to hold it, but that last one might be kind of difficult to do. Just do what works best for you. This works best for me because I can just put my vice grip, chain vice grip thing here up against a motor mount. So take those 3 bolts out, the 10mm wrench, and then we'll pull that pulley off. So I got a little frustrated and I got this off. In the next video segment, I'm going to say it doesn't come off of there because of how the engine is. Yeah, just put a piece of pipe or a pry bar in here like this. Just give it a little bit of pressure to push it that way, and you can get that pulley out. So ignore what I say about this not coming out in the next segment. It absolutely does. You just got to be a little persistent. Now that we've got this pulley loose, it will not come out right now, just because of the way things are with how the engine's sitting next to this. So what we need to do is take some bolts out, and that can stay there. We just need to remember to have that in position when we put the new one back in. We need to take this bolt right here out, and we need to take this bolt right here out, and then I'm going to have to get some light and position the camera to show you this last one. There's this bolt right here. That is your front cover bolt. We do not want to take that one out. The one that we want to remove for the water pump is this one down here. So, yeah, I mean, I think you guys will be able to see it on the video. It's even hard for me to see right now trying to film and show it. Front cover, water pump. Front cover, water pump. It's down underneath this. So we'll go ahead and remove those with, I believe, yep, 8mm. Okay, now that we have those bolts out, and I will tell you they're all the same length, so it doesn't matter where they go back. And I'll also tell you that one on the bottom there is easier to get to from underneath the car. Now that we have all those, we can, oh, I might need a little bit more than this. Usually you can just wiggle them up and down, back and forth, and they'll come out. But that seems to be in there really well, so I'm going to grab some slip joint pliers and wiggle a little bit harder on it. Alright, I've got it loose. Now something you might have to do if it's really stuck, which mine was, you put this flat and then you get a pry bar, or I'm just using a length of pipe, and I hit it right here and hit it down, and then I went underneath and I hit it back up, because you don't want to do this all from the top or all from the bottom, because if you do that you're going to ruin your engine block, and that's an incredibly expensive thing to fix. So if you just tap it from the top until you see it move, tap it from the bottom until you see it move, just back and forth, and you can take this out. Now there's going to be a lot of coolant that comes out when you take this out, so have a catch pan ready underneath. Alright, now the actual removal of this, I had to end up dropping the engine slightly so I could get it to clear the frame here. So just lower your floor jack, and if you're using the 2x4 method I mentioned, you might want to have a real strong friend around, or have another 2x4 cut slightly slightly lower, so you can knock the tall 2x4 out and drop it onto the slightly shorter one. I ended up lowering it about 3/4 of an inch, and then I was able to twist it out of there. So now that we've got it out, we're going to want to make sure that hole is nice and clean, everything around there. Try not to get anything inside the engine. If you got to leave it overnight, stuff it full of rags, make sure nothing gets in there, because if you get stuff in there, it's going to ruin your cooling system. You know, a little bit of dirt probably won't hurt, but any foreign debris in there is going to make things worse for you. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit, and then we can go ahead and put the new one in. Okay, time for the new pump to go in, and I just bought a Napa branded one. It doesn't really matter. Another tip is to give this pump a couple of turns before you put it in. That way, if it's got a bad seal or it's got a flat spot in it from sitting for so long, it won't leak. So it doesn't look like it did any damage. So go ahead and put this back in from the bottom up. Okay, get it in there, and then I can just pop that in. If you get that O-ring a little wet with some coolant, it will go in a lot easier. Okay, with the pump back in position, we simply go through and put everything back on the way we took it off. I'm not going to make a video for that. Obviously, if you got this far, you can just watch the video again, see how I took stuff off, do the opposite to put everything back on. And then I will, however, do a video on refilling your coolant system. So I'll go ahead and put everything back together, and then I'll show you refilling the coolant. Alright, we've got it all back together, and now I'm going to give you a few tips on refilling your coolant system. Number one, make sure the radiator's closed. On this car, it's a plastic plug into a plastic radiator, so don't crank too hard on it or you're going to split it, and then you got to redo a radiator. No fun. Second tip, just buy the concentrate. A lot of places I see it's the same price to get full strength antifreeze or the 50-50 premix. So you can either buy a gallon of coolant or you can spend the same amount of money on a half gallon of coolant and a half gallon of water. I buy the full strength stuff and then I mix it myself, and since I live up north I mix it a little bit stronger than 50-50, because as you can see 50-50 is only good for -34. It got colder than that where I live last year, so I'm going to go just about 60-40. So I've got this is actually mixed up with half a gallon of water that I'm stirring up, and this whole car, from what I see online, takes 1.75 gallons. So you can't put a gallon of coolant and then a gallon of water in here and expect it to be mixed right. It'd be mixed right for living up north, I suppose, but also we didn't take 1.75 gallons out of here. We took a lot out, but not quite that much. So I'm going with premix, and we can start pouring it into this reservoir here. When it gets up to the maximum level, which it's going to suck a bunch of this down, I'll start the car and then we'll go from there. Alright, well, it just stopped, but if we watch long enough, you'll see some bubbles coming up out of here and going into the reservoir. That's the engine filling up. So what we're going to do next is go ahead and start the engine, and we're going to go wide open on the heat. That way we fill the heater core with coolant too, because that could have drained. And then we're going to rev it a couple of times, just full throttle. The car will stop. It won't be dangerous or anything. Car will stop the engine from revving before anything bad happens. Just rev it twice. We'll come back and we'll put some more coolant in it, because it's going to suck that coolant down. This is the point where you might want to have a second person with you, just so they can fill it up as it goes down. And you can leave the cap off to do this. Once you start it, it's probably a good idea to check the pump. Make sure nothing is coming out. Make sure your belt's riding on the pulleys correctly. And then you're going to want to go underneath and make sure there's no coolant pouring out anywhere. Now, I did spill a little bit. I used some water, some brake clean, that sort of thing to clean it up. So you know, there's a little bit dripping out of there, but it was before. I'm not worried about that. That's just dripping out of that little skid plate for the AC compressor. So, got the heat going full blast. Everything's looking good. No leaks. So we're at maximum. I'll go ahead and rev it, and we'll see where that fluid level goes. We're going to want to drive it a little bit, and we're going to want to stop several times. Make sure that coolant is staying in the reservoir. If it drains it, simply add more until you get up to that minimum line. Oh, there you can see some bubbles going through, so we found an air pocket. Getting rid of that. And what I forgot to show you guys is once you fill it, you can go through, and the hoses that go to the radiator, just give them a good hard squeeze a few times on both sides. It'll help get the bubbles back up into the reservoir, get rid of that air in there. And the reason we're doing this all through the reservoir is because there is no cap on the radiator, capless radiator system, so you got to do it all from the reservoir. No big deal. Once you know your coolant level's good, something you might want to invest in, a whole $5, whoops, dripping a little bit, is a coolant strength tester. Go ahead and fill it up here. Make sure it's level, which is what that top red indicator is for. If we look down here, I'm good for just past 45 below zero, which is what I was aiming for. So that is how you spill coolant all over your engine trying to film on YouTube. So that is how you replace a water pump and refill your coolant in a 2014 naturally aspirated Ford Focus. Okay, I'm going to quickly address the stud coming out with the nut problem. So to get this back apart and to put this stud back in, you need an E10. I can get the camera to focus. You need an E10 socket, and how I'm going to take care of this, I'm just going to lightly clamp that in a vise. You don't want to crush it. And then get the ratchet switch around here, just crank this in. Okay, so what you can do now is once you run out of ability to turn this through, you can clamp right here where that changes. You can also use a vice grip or a pliers or something like that, and I'm clamping it at an angle so I don't get these threads in the vise. But then we're just going to take our 18 and turn this the rest of the way off. There we go. So we've got that off. We can reinstall this stud. I'm probably going to put a drop of Loctite on it, and then that can be back in the car for when we put the motor mount back in. So when you crank these studs back in, if yours happen to come out, you go all the way down to that collar between where this thread ends and the threads going into here start. This is just aluminum. Do not crank it in there real hard or you'll strip it out and you'll make your life 10 times more miserable.